Are we ready, Gov Ben?
We're,
Or other
we're
resource
ready. We're
persons?
ready.
Okay. All right. Good morning. It's 9:05 in the morning.
Sige lang.
We'd
Kasi
like
may
to.
15-minute break, di ba? Ay, sorry.
Could we mute our if we're not the one speaking, may we request our resource persons and guests to mute our microphones. Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the initial briefing of the DBCC for the Senate budget briefings, which we conduct every year. And it's a very important year given the circumstances we find ourselves in. And we'll turn it over as a tradition. We'd like to greet first, of course, our colleagues present. And we have with us Senator Ping Lacson, Vice Chair Amy Marcos, Vice Chair Cynthia Villar, Vice Chair Joel Villanueva, Senior Vice Chair Pia Cayetano, Majority Leader Zubiri, Senator Francis Tolentino, Vice Chair Risa Ontiveros, Senator Nancy Binay, Vice Chair Bato de la Rosa, Vice Chair Win Gatchalian, Senator Kiko Pangilinan, and Vice Chair Senator Grace Poe. And we'd like to acknowledge the agencies present. Of course, Governor Ben of the BSP, Secretary Carl Chua of the NEDA, Secretary Sonny Dominguez of the Department of Finance, and USEC, IC Tina Kanda, OIC. Morning, ma'am, of the
Morning po.
DBM. So welcome to the
Morning,
BSP, NEDA, DOF, and DBM families. Magandang umaga sa lahat ng nakikinig. For greater specificity, we'll ask our committee secretary to acknowledge the guests present. Comsec, please.
Good morning, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman. The committee would like to acknowledge the presence of the following persons for today's briefing. Department of Budget and Management Acting Secretary Tina Rose Marie Canda, Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas Governor Benjamin Jokno, National Economic and Development Authority Secretary Carl Kendrick Chua, Department of Finance Secretary Carlos Dominguez, Bureau of Customs Commissioner Ray Leonardo Guerrero, Bureau of Internal Revenue Commissioner Cesar Dulay, Office of the Deputy Executive Secretary for General Administration, Deputy Executive Secretary McHill Bryant Fernandez, Philippine Institute for Development Studies, President Aniceto Orbeta Jr., Tariff Commission Chairperson Marilu Mendoza, Philippine Statistics Authority Undersecretary Dennis Mapa, Philippine Statistical Research and Training Institute Executive Director Josefina Venegas Almeda, Philippine National Volunteer Service Coordinating Agency Executive Director Donald James Gawe, Commission on Population Development Undersecretary Juan Antonio Perez III. The committee likewise acknowledges all undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and directors present in this meeting. Thank you, Your Honor, that's all.
Comsec, we'd also like to greet Commissioner Guerrero and Commissioner Dulay, Chairperson Mendoza, Yusek Janet Abuelo is also here joining us, and Yusek Kim is also here. So with the indulgence of our colleagues, we'll turn it over to our resource persons, and then we'll acknowledge our resource persons, our senators in the order mentioned earlier. So Governor Ben, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Committee Chair Juan Edgardo Alcala, members of the Senate Committee on Finance, members of the Economic Team, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, as a resource institution of the Development Budget Coordination Committee, will present the macroeconomic assumptions underlying the fiscal year 2022 proposed national government budget, along with the key developments and prospects, supporting our assessment on monetary, external, and banking sectors. More than a year since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippine economy is gradually recovering. The unprecedented crisis called for an unprecedented response, and the whole of government acted promptly and decisively. The government's mass vaccination program is picking up its pace and scope, and is expected to accelerate further. The Bayanihan 1 and 2, as well as the provisions under the 2021 national budget, were designed to support the safe reopening of the economy. Moreover, the government passed into law reforms that could foster a strong and faster economic rebound while limiting the scarring effects of the pandemic on the economy. This includes the passage of the Financial Institutions Strategic Transfer or FIST Act and the Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives for Enterprises or CREATE Act. Meanwhile, the proposed government financial institutions unified initiatives to distress enterprises for economic recovery or guide bill aims to strengthen the capacity of government financial institutions such as the Field Guarantee, Land Bank, and the Development Bank of the Philippines to assist micro, small, and medium enterprises cope with the effects of the COVID-19. Given that the nature of the current crisis is primarily an issue of public health, the government's public health measures, fiscal stimulus, and structural reforms have stood as the country's major response against the pandemic. Complementing the government's response, the BSP has implemented temporary and time-bound monetary policy measures to ensure ample liquidity in the financial system, restore financial market functioning, and shore up market confidence. These measures include a mix of decisive monetary policy adjustments and extraordinary liquidity measures, along with regulatory relief and forbearance measures. On its recent policy meeting, the Monetary Board decided to keep its monetary policy settings unchanged. The Monetary Board remains keen on sustaining monetary policy support for as long as necessary in order for the momentum of economic recovery to gain more traction, as well as to help boost domestic demand and market confidence, especially as risk aversion continues to temper credit activity. As of September 2021, the PSP's measures have injected into the financial system about 2.3 trillion pesos in liquidity, equivalent to 12.7% of the country's full-year nominal GDP for 2020. Given the whole of government response and bolstered by years of resolute reforms, the resulting 2020 key economic indicators show that the domestic economy had remained resilient against the adverse effects of the global pandemic. The country's macroeconomic fundamentals remain generally intact, as evidenced by the quarter-on-quarter improvements in gross domestic product outturn towards the year-end, within target inflation, ample financial system liquidity, and robust external payments position. At the same time, the banking system continues to be stable and resilient, while the public sector debt remains manageable. In the next slides, I will go through the recent trends and developments for 2021 in the real, monetary, financial, and external sectors of the economy. The Philippine economy begins its positive growth. After 5 consecutive quarters of economic contractions, the economy posted a positive growth in the second quarter of 2021, with real GDP expanding by 11.8% from 17% contraction in Q2 2020. In terms of production, the expansion was mainly contributed by manufacturing. Q2 2021 grew by 22.3%, while Q1 2021 grew by 0.5%, followed by construction. Construction grew by 25.7% from a negative 22.6% the previous quarter. And wholesale and retail trade grew by 5.4%, following a negative 3.4% in the previous quarter. By expenditure, growth was driven by household consumption, It grew by 7.2% compared to negative 4.7% the previous quarter. Public construction grew by 49.7% from 25.3% the previous quarter. And investment in durable equipment grew by 89.2% from negative 10.3% from the previous quarter. So almost all sectors and expenditure segments of the economy bounced back during the quarter. This seems to indicate that the country is learning how to live with the virus by managing risk to the safe reopening of the economy and calibrated reimposition of granular quarantine restrictions only where it is necessary. Headline inflation rose to 4.9% in August 2021 from 4% in July, bringing the year-to-date average inflation to 4.4%. The increase in headline inflation was driven mainly by higher price increases of key food items, particularly vegetables and fish, reflecting impact of strong monsoon rains. Meanwhile, increased electricity rates due to higher generation and transmission charges, along with increased prices of LPG, contributed to the rise in non-food inflation. Core inflation, which excludes selected volatile food and energy items to depict underlying demand-side pressures, also increased to 3.3% in August from 2.9% in July. Average inflation is projected to settle slightly above the upper end of the government's target band of 2 to 4% in 2021. Nevertheless, with the continued and timely implementation of direct supply measures and programs to mitigate supply-side pressures on meat and other food prices, inflation is projected to ease towards the midpoint of the target range in 2022 and 2023. Latest assessment likewise indicates that the risk to the inflation outlook remain broadly balanced over the policy horizon. Now moving on to the domestic liquidity in the financial system, it remains ample. M3 expanded by 5.9% year-on-year in July 2021, slower than the 6.5% growth recorded in June. Meanwhile, bank lending activity shows some indications of improvement. Preliminary data shows that outstanding loans of universal and commercial banks, net of reverse repurchase placements with BSP, decreased by 0.7% year-on-year in July. That's lower compared to the 2% contraction in June. On a month-on-month seasonally adjusted basis, outstanding universal and commercial bank loans, net of RRPs, went up by 0.5%. However, credit activity has remained weak due to risk aversion and weak economic sentiment. Bank credit continues to decline as the necessary measures to address the still elevated number of COVID-19 cases constrained domestic economic activity and dampened market sentiment. On the whole, Philippine banks have continued to rein in the NPL ratio within manageable levels, reflecting gains from prudent reforms and improvement in banks' credit risk management systems. Gross non-performing loans ratio increased to 4.5%, while the NPL coverage ratio on the banking system declined to 82.4% in June. Moving forward, the BSP anticipates that the non-performing loans of the banking system will remain within manageable levels. The existing regulatory relief measures serve as an interim measure pending the full operationalization of the FIST Act in 2021. The FIST Act will reinforce banks' capital and liquidity position in the long term by allowing financial institutions to dispose their non-performing assets, increase their risk-bearing capacity, and enhance their capability to provide financial services to productive sectors of the economy. Moreover, Philippine banks remain well capitalized. As of the first quarter of 2021, the capital adequacy ratio, or CAR, of the banking system is at 16.9%, well above the 10% minimum threshold set by the BSP. The BSP stands committed and ready with its enhanced on-site and off-site surveillance tools and prudential policy toolkit to promote the financial sector reform agenda for sustaining the sound and stable financial system conducive to a strong, dynamic, and inclusive economic growth recovery of the country. Now, moving on to the external sector, the gross international reserves, which stood at $107.2 billion as of July 2021, continued to provide more than adequate external liquidity buffer. The gross international reserves level is equivalent to 12.2 months' worth of imports of goods and payments of services and primary income. It is also 7.7 times the country's short-term external debt based on original maturity and 5 times based on residual maturity. The gross international reserves is supported by improving inflows of cash remittances from overseas workers. Now, on the foreign exchange market, the recent peso depreciation is partly influenced by broad US dollar strength, driven by risk-off sentiment over the spread of the Delta COVID-19 variant, and to markets' perceived shift to a hawkish tone by the US Federal Reserve. In addition, the observed pickup in corporate dollar demand as the economy gradually reopens and the Fitch ratings downgrade for the country's sovereign credit rating added pressure on the peso. However, the more than adequate gross international reserves is expected to temper the peso depreciation. In addition, we expect the peso to be supported by structural flows through recovery in exports, overseas Filipino remittances, the business process outsourcing receipts, and others. Foreign exchange inflows related to foreign direct investments are also expected to help shore up the currency. Mr. Chair and the members of the Senate Committee on Finance, let me now present the macroeconomic assumptions underlying the fiscal year 2022 national government budget. As mentioned, inflation is projected to settle close to the high end of the inflation target for 2021, then decelerate near the midpoint of the target band for 2022. On global crude oil prospects, elevated global oil prices could persist in the near term given improvements in world oil demand. Nevertheless, international oil prices could moderate as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and its allies, alongside U.S. oil producers, expand their oil production. We expect the peso exchange rate to be within the 48 to 53 peso per US $1 range. While we expect some depreciation pressures on the peso from the eventual US federal rate adjustment, structural foreign exchange flows and hefty gross international reserves could provide support to the peso. Moreover, the 364-day T-bill rates and 180-day LIBOR could remain low in the near term, followed by a gradual rise over the forecast horizon as the global economy recovers. Now, on the external trade, sustained recovery momentum in the country's trading partners, notably US, Japan, and China, could underpin the pickup in goods exports. At the same time, goods imports could recover as restrictions subside amid widespread vaccinations and as domestic demand recover from a contraction in 2020. While we see some signs of economic improvements, we should also recognize some risk ahead. The global economic recovery is expected to be uneven, especially between advanced economies and emerging market economies. The path to recovery would depend on the reach of mass vaccination and effectiveness of policy support. In addition, potential further rise in international commodity prices due to improving global demand amid lingering supply chain bottlenecks could pose upside pressures to inflation. On the domestic front, the threat of further increases in COVID-19 infections remains, especially with the emergence of more contagious and more resistant virus variants, such as the Delta COVID-19 variant. Clearly, economic recovery is highly contingent on the speed of the vaccination rollout, the existing capacity of the country's healthcare system, and the citizens' willingness to observe the appropriate health protocol. Moving forward, the BSP's actions and policy thrust will continue to be anchored in its core mandates of promoting price and financial stability. Toward this end, the BSP will continue to pursue appropriate policy actions responsive to the needs of the time. On monetary policy, the BSP will remain vigilant over the current inflation dynamics to ensure that the monetary policy stance continues to support economic recovery to the extent that the inflation outlook would allow. On the financial sector, the BSP will intensify its monitoring and surveillance over its supervised institutions to ensure that they remain responsive to emerging risks and to promote the continued soundness, stability, resilience, and inclusivity of the banking system, particularly through the pursuit of enhanced digitalization. Third, on the external sector, the BSP will remain supportive of policies that will help strengthen the economy's resilience to external shocks, including that of maintaining a market-determined exchange rate, keeping a comfortable level of reserves, and keeping the country's external debt manageable. Furthermore, the BSP has long recognized the role of digital platforms in achieving greater efficiency and financial inclusion. The acceleration of digital transformation will help bolster the path towards a more technologically advanced and more inclusive Philippine economy in the post-COVID era. Last year, the BSP launched the Digital Payments Transformation Roadmap for 2020-2023. With this roadmap, we aim to transform the country into a cash-like society through digitalization of payments and increasing number of Filipinos with access to financial services. At the same time, we intend to make available more innovative and responsive digital financial products and services. Recent data suggests increased use of electronic platforms. In the first 7 months of 2021, the value of transactions done through InstaPay expanded by more than 180%, and through PesoNet by more than 80%. In terms of volume, the transactions via InstaPay and PesoNet have nearly doubled relative to the previous year. The diligent use of digital payments could also help reduce the need for mobility and prevent health risks from face-to-face and over-the-counter financial transactions. Last June, the BSP issued the Open Finance Framework, a key enabler for digital transformation and financial inclusion by promoting consent-driven data portability, interoperability, and collaborative partnerships between financial institutions and fintech players. Given all our efforts towards digitalization, we envision a Philippines where everyone is empowered with financial accounts and will be able to make use of a wide range of financial transactions digitally. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, allow me to end with the key messages of this presentation. This presentation provides evidence that the country's economic fundamentals have remained generally firm amid the adverse impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. There is optimism over the macroeconomic prospects given the acceleration in COVID-19, inoculation in the country, continued policy support, and improved global economic outlook. At the same time, the effective management of risk through safe reopening of businesses, expansion of the country's health system, and targeted implementation of quarantine restrictions as necessary could help the economy pave the path towards a safe and strong recovery. We must keep this momentum going and stay on guard against emerging risks. Forcing the road to recovery requires consistent, purposeful, and coordinated efforts. The national government's fiscal and public health measures remain crucial in sustaining the recovery. Its commitment to pursue the infrastructure program and key structural reforms will also help address the long-term scarring effects of the pandemic. The BSP remains one with the national government in supporting the Philippine economy towards economic recovery. The BSP reaffirms its commitment to sustaining monetary policy support until the recovery fully gets underway. We will remain watchful of domestic and global developments and stand ready to adjust our policy settings as needed to ensure price and financial stability conducive to sustainable economic recovery. Together, let us continue to fuel the country's momentum towards a safer, stronger, and more inclusive Philippine economy. That ends my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Governor Diokno. Some of our colleagues have since joined us. We'd like to acknowledge Senate President Pro Tempore Ralph Recto, our Minority Leader, Senator Frank Drilon, Senator Coco Pimentel, and Vice Chair Senator Bongo. Morning, Your Honors. I was reminded, Your Honors, by the committee that the tradition is the four officers of the Senate also have priority, as we saw in the Blue Ribbon Committee yesterday. So, for the record, the order of questioning is now as follows. The chairman, but the chairman will give way to the members. Second is Senator Recto, our Senate Pro Temp. Third is Majority Leader, Senator Mix. Fourth is Minority Leader Drilon. Fifth is Senator Lacson. Sixth, Senators Marcos, Villar, Villanueva, Cayetano, Tolentino, Antiveros, Binay, De La Rosa, Gatchalian, Milinan, Poe, Pimentel, and Go. And we will give each senator 10 minutes, but again, we'll allow the agencies to present first. So next to present, Your Honors, is Secretary Carl Chua and the agencies of NEDA. Secretary Chua, good morning. You have the floor, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My presentation today will focus on the socio-economic performance and macroeconomic outlook amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Since this is the last budget to be presented by the Duterte administration, let me first begin with a recap of our economic foundations, followed by recent economic developments, the impact of COVID-19 and the quarantines, our prospect for recovery, and key legislation to support our recovery. Let me begin with our strong economic foundations. In 2016, the Duterte administration had one singular vision that by 2022, we would have reduced the poverty rate from 21.6% to 14% of the population, thereby lifting 6 million Filipinos out of poverty. We also envision the Philippines graduating to becoming an upper middle income country by 2022, similar to countries like Thailand and China today. We also have a long-term vision, the Ambisyon Natin 2040, which we envision the Philippines to eradicate extreme poverty, in other words, no one hungry, and to join the ranks of high-income country status, similar to Japan and South Korea today. As we reflect on the past years prior to COVID-19, the 2022 promise of lifting 6 million Filipinos out of poverty was achieved actually around 2018, or 4 years ahead of our 2022 target. In 2018, the Philippine Statistics Authority recomputed the poverty incidence to be at 23.5% in 2015 and 16.7% in 2018. This translates to the 6 million lifted out of poverty. And without the impact of COVID-19 and the quarantines, we would have easily achieved our target of 14% or lower. The reason for our strong progress prior to the COVID-19 pandemic is our commitment to our 0 to 10-point socio-economic agenda, which the Duterte administration presented at the start of the term to guide our economic policy. They are: number 1, macroeconomic policies; number 2, tax reform; number 3, ease of doing business; number 4, infrastructure; number 5, rural development; number 6, land management; number 7, human capital development; science and arts for number 8; number 9, social protection programs, which includes the national ID; and number 10, reproductive health law. Our assessment is that at this time, we have achieved around 85%, or those colored green, with significant policy reforms or progress in those areas. And we will continue to work in the last 9 or 10 months to complete the rest of the commitments. These have resulted into an economic foundation that helps us better prepare for the upcoming COVID-19 pandemic. Some of these strong fundamentals are the following: strong economic growth that averaged 6.6% prior to COVID-19. We were likely to become an upper middle income country in 2020. We achieved low and stable inflation. The average is exactly at the midpoint of the inflation target of 3%, to a large part enabled by the rice tariffication law. We achieved one of the strongest fiscal positions with the highest revenue and lowest debt to GDP ratio. A big part of this enabled by the tax reform. This has allowed us to fund our Build infrastructure program, where we almost doubled as a share of GDP, close to 5%. We achieved also the highest ever credit rating, and this not only benefits government, but all businesses and households who borrow. And more importantly, households and individuals benefit from much lower unemployment, underemployment, and as I mentioned, the poverty incidence. Let me now go to recent economic developments. What we are seeing today since the start of the pandemic is the COVID-19 virus is not going to go away easily. This chart shows you the trend in active, or rather daily cases. We are in another spike. The blue chart shows you the total for Philippines, while the red line shows you the one for NCR. And as a result of the virus, we have had one of the longest quarantines. Our initial high-risk aversion has artificially restricted our productivity and economic growth. Mr. Chair, our capital and both physical and human capital stock have not been depleted. However, because of the quarantines, we prevent the efficient use of our human and physical capital. This chart shows you that the varying community quarantines across the months, from green, which is no community quarantine, all the way to red, which is the enhanced community quarantine. And presently in NCR, which accounts for 32% of the population, or rather of the share of the GDP, we are in the MECQ. The other regions also have varying levels of quarantines. As a result of our prolonged quarantines, economic performance has been affected, but we are seeing signs of recovery. From a slump in 2020, we saw for the first time a strong positive growth of 11.8% in the second quarter of 2021. The average growth in 2021 first semester is 3.7%. And our actions in dealing with the virus will determine the course in the next few quarters. In terms of the component of our economy, in the second quarter of 2021, which is the second to the last column, we see across the board growth and recovery from consumption to investment to industry and services. Only two sectors recorded negative growth in the second quarter. The first is government spending, which is minus 4.9%. But the reason for this is the very high base in the second quarter of last year, where we implemented Bayanihan 1, which also gave the biggest social amelioration program. We are also seeing a slight negative in agriculture, and this is largely driven by the African swine fever, which affected our pork production. But across the sectors, in particular, capital formation, with a growth of 75.5%, we are seeing significant initial recovery, which we hope to sustain, hopefully after the spike caused by the Delta variant. Let me now go to the type of movement, which is also one of the underpinnings of our recovery. Unlike in 2020, where we restricted public transport, which led to an 80% collapse in visits to public transport, we are better managing the risk this year. The red line is the visit to public transport last year. The blue line is the visit to public transport this year. We are just down by 20 to 25%, even during the ECQ or the MECQ. This is one way of our risk management to allow workers to continue working while addressing the highest sources of risk, for instance, gatherings and dine-ins. We are also seeing much progress in people actually going to work. Compared to last year, the blue line shows that we are down by 20% compared to the height of the 80% collapse in people actually going to work. So these are important indicators that we monitor daily to determine the course of our economic recovery. In terms of employment, from the lowest ever unemployment and underemployment rates prior to COVID-19, we saw an initial spike when we imposed the harshest ECQ last year, but we have actually managed to bring this down. In July 2021, the labor force survey shows an unemployment rate of 6.9%. However, underemployment, those with work but in need of more income, have risen to around 20.9%. There are two reasons for this. One is the capacity restrictions, which does not allow some workers to work full-time. The second is the risk aversion because of the spread of the Delta variant. Let me now go to job creation. What we found in the past few months, as we do the labor force survey monthly starting this year, is that job creation is highly correlated to the level of quarantine. So between January and April last year, we lost 8.7 million jobs when we restricted the economy. However, as we gradually opened the economy, we saw job creation in the positive territory. In April 2021, we lost 2.1 million jobs when we reverted to ECQ. But when we gradually reopened as safely as we can, we were able to add to the number of jobs. So the net effect between January and June 2021 is a positive 2.5 million job creation. However, yesterday, the Philippine Statistics Authority reported that between June and July, we lost 3.4 million jobs. There are two reasons for this. Half of the job loss is in agriculture, and a big part of that is triggered by the start of the rainy typhoon season. However, the other part is also triggered by concerns of some workers about catching the virus, especially the Delta variant. So there is actually a question that asks them why they have decided not to find work. And as a result, our net employment creation since the start of the pandemic is down by 800,000. Hopefully, as we manage the Delta variant, we can reverse this in the coming months. Our prospects for 2021 remain encouraging and will allow us to recover to pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2022 or early 2023. This will prevent long-term scarring and productivity losses. Our revised economic growth estimate for this year is 4 to 5%. This is primarily driven by the Delta variant and our heightened quarantines in the third quarter. We expect the economy to bounce back strongly by 7 to 9% next year and to moderate to our long-term growth trajectory of 6 to 7%. Mr. Chair, there are three enablers of this growth estimate or projection. The first is our acceleration of the vaccination program. The second is the safe reopening of the economy while strictly adhering to the health protocols, and the full implementation of the recovery package, which we already have with us. I will skip the medium-term macroeconomic assumptions as this was presented earlier by the central bank. Let me now go to some of the details of our enablers of recovery. Our COVID-19 vaccination is on track. A total of 52.8 million doses have arrived as of September 7, and this chart gives you some of the breakdowns, a combination of purchases, donations, and through our COVAX facility. We are also ramping up the inoculation. As of September 7, a total of 36.2 million have received one or two doses of the vaccine. 20.9 million have completed the first dose and 15.2 million the second dose. And this chart gives you a summary of the inoculation by the priority categories from A1 senior citizens to all the way to A5 or the indigent population. Let me now talk about the COVID-19 and quarantines in recent weeks. Despite the Delta surge, the imposition of the MECQ in high-risk areas, including NCR, since August 21, is actually our proactive response to balance the needs of the people, whether this be from COVID or non-COVID concerns, including their other sickness and hunger, as we also manage the spread of the more contagious Delta variant. Just to give the committee an idea of the status of the economy and employment, we in NEDA calculate this regularly to advise the IATF so that the decision will see both the COVID and the non-COVID factors. For the period September 1 to 7, 54% of the economy is under MECQ, 15% in GCQ, HR, meaning GCQ with heightened restrictions, and so on. Of course, this will affect millions of workers. As of the week of September 1 to 7, 15.647 million people are in the MECQ area and 7.5 million are in the GCQ area. So this gives us an idea of how many people and a share of the economy is affected. We also compute, Mr. Chair, the impact of every week of additional quarantine. For instance, in the NCR Plus area, we were able to reduce the impact on the economy from 144 billion per week when we were in ECQ to 73 billion per week when we are in MECQ as we are today. We also compute the impact on the poor. We are able to reduce that to around 82 to 123,000, and the impact on the unemployed by half to around 310,000. So this one, Mr. Chair, we monitor regularly so that we can strike the optimal balance between COVID and non-COVID concerns of the people. Let me now talk about more details on the prospects of our recovery. Apart from the budget of this year and next year, we will continue to work hard in implementing our build infrastructure program and to implement our CREATE law on the lowering of taxes and the granting of performance-based and targeted incentives. In addition, we are working on the passage with the Senate on the amendments to the Public Service Act, Retail Trade Liberalization Act, and Foreign Investment Act to further encourage more investment and job creation. For infrastructure, we will maintain our more than 1 trillion peso infrastructure program over the medium term. Our proposal next year is 1.2 trillion, and we will maintain this in the next 2 years because of the strong job creation and multiplier effect of the infrastructure program. We are also working on digital infrastructure. I am pleased to report that as of September 3, 41.9 million Filipinos have registered for Step 1 or the demographic data collection. We are doing this either house to house for low income or online for those with access to computers or tablets or smartphones. 28.6 million have been registered for Step 2 or the biometrics. This is the visit to the registration center that is available in almost all municipalities in the country. Unfortunately, whenever we declare MECQ or higher, some LGUs temporarily stop the registration because of health protocols. At the same time, 5.2 million low-income families have applied for bank accounts because we have land bank stationed in Step 2. This will help us achieve our 100% financial inclusion target by the end of the year. And those that were verified to be unique persons, they are beginning to receive their national ID. So 1.5 million have actually received their physical ID cards. And the rest, we will continue to work hard to deliver as many as we can. Our target, Mr. Chair, for this year is 50 million registered to the national ID. The balance to be provided next year, and hopefully the qualified individuals of around 95 million will receive by the end of the Duterte administration. The priority use cases are financial inclusion, as I mentioned, the provision of more targeted ayuda or social protection subsidies, and possibly to aid also in the COVID-19 registration and distribution in the coming years. Finally, let me talk about the key legislation to support the recovery. The LEDAC Execom has agreed with the members the following 12 high priority legislative measures to be hopefully passed by the end of the year. The first three are the economic liberalization bills that I mentioned. 4, 5, and 6 are the remaining tax reform packages. So package 3 on valuation reform, package 4 on the PIFITA or on passive income, and number 6 is on the POGO. Number 7 is part of our recovery measure or the guide bill to provide support, liquidity and solvency support to firms in need. Number 8 is the Department of OFW. Number 9, the Virology Center. Number 10, the amendments to the Agri-Agra law. Number 11, the BFP modernization, which I understand has been ratified. And number 12 is the MUP or the Unified System of Separation, Retirement, and Pension of the military and uniformed personnel. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary Carl. We understand we're also joined. We'd like to acknowledge the presence of Senator Gordon, one of the committee vice chairs. And Sec Carl, before we go to DOF, you might want to add to your list the list of digital bills, because I noticed there's nothing on digital in the LEDAC list, and there are a number of digital bills pending in the Senate. And you could take advantage of the natural migration to digital platforms, I think, and somehow shepherd that to, to transform our economy in that way. So we'd now like to turn the floor over to Secretary Sonny Dominguez of the Department of Finance. Sir, morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Committee Chairman Senator Sani Angara, Senate President Pro Tempore Ralph Recto, Majority Leader Migs Zubiri, Minority Leader Frank Drilon, Senator Pia Cayetano, Senator Grace Poe, Senator Panfilo Lacson, Senator Amy Marcos, Senator Cynthia Villar, Senator Nancy Binay, Senator Risa Ontiveros, Senator Joey Villanueva, Senator Francis Tolentino, Senator Francis Pangilinan, Senator Win Gatchalian, Senator Bato de la Rosa, Senator Bongo, fellow workers in government, good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to brief the Senate about the national government's fiscal position. Before proceeding, allow me to thank our legislators again for passing the bold tax reforms of the Duterte administration. These measures made us better prepared for the difficult times than at any point in our recent history. We also thank you for passing the Bayanihan 1 and 2. Both laws enable the government to effectively respond to the global health emergency without imposing a heavy debt burden on the next generation. The two measures exemplify the fiscal responsibility we need to guide our economy back to health. The Congress must be credited for the passage of several reform measures that will enhance our path to economic recovery. The most important of these is the CREATE law, which makes possible the largest economic stimulus program for our businesses. In recent press releases of publicly listed companies, they always mention that CREATE helped them maintain or increase their profitability and their ability to cope with the pandemic. CREATE gives out almost 100 billion pesos worth of tax relief annually to the corporate sector to sustain our employment or use for investments. We have kickstarted the engagement of a more flexible fiscal incentive system through the Fiscal Incentives Review Board. As chairperson of this board, we are determined to aggressively pursue investments that would greatly benefit the Filipino people. I must also mention that the FISC law that would enable our banking system to withstand the pressures of a major economic contraction and maintain its viability. The fiscal discipline and economic reforms that work, the Philippines came fully prepared to meet the global health crisis head on. A discussion of our economic and fiscal prospects requires an appreciation of the context that enabled us to meet the crisis without succumbing to it. Thus, my presentation today will highlight our 2016 to 2020 accomplishments. This will be followed by an update of our 2021 fiscal performance, our medium-term fiscal program, and the economic priorities in the remaining months of President Duterte's term. When the pandemic struck, we were financially ready. Our strong fiscal position, buttressed by our tax reforms and better tax administration, served us well. The government was able to collect revenues totaling 12.4 trillion pesos from 2016 to 2020. This is 20% or 2 trillion pesos more than what the previous administration collected in its 6-year term. The enacted tax reform measures such as the train law, new sin taxes, and the Tax Amnesty Act collectively added 347 billion pesos more to our coffers from 2018 to 2020. This translates to more than 100 billion pesos additional taxes collected annually. From 2016 to 2020, the Duterte administration's revenue effort climbed to 15.9% of GDP from an average of 14% of GDP during the previous administration. In fact, in 2019, we achieved a two-decade high revenue effort of 16.1%. This underscores the improved efficiency and professionalism of our revenue collection agencies. Despite the pandemic, revenue effort remained at 15.9% of GDP in 2020. Meanwhile, the total dividend remittances collected from government-owned or government-controlled corporations reached 317.5 billion pesos under President Duterte's term. The amount includes dividend contributions retained by our state banks to boost their capital requirements. Our total dividend collection is almost double the level of the past administration. These additional funds helped us meet the requirements for our COVID-19 response. The Duterte administration maintained a prudent deficit level, notwithstanding our large investments in the Build program, which is the President's main strategy to help Filipinos lift themselves out of poverty. From a meager 2.9% of GDP in 2015, infrastructure spending nearly doubled to 5.4% of GDP in 2019. Last year, despite the effects of the pandemic, we were able to maintain our infrastructure expenditures at 4.8% of GDP. Expectedly, the unplanned spending needed for our pandemic response temporarily pushed up our deficit levels. Last year, our deficit to GDP ratio expanded to 7.6%, or about double the threshold we worked hard to maintain. Nevertheless, this level is still sustainable, considering that we had to rapidly enlarge our healthcare capacity and procure sufficient doses of vaccines for our people. Prudent fiscal management, appropriate economic investments, and improved revenue collections brought the country to the highest credit rating levels we have ever achieved. These ratings have been maintained amid the wave of downgrades globally. Our high credit ratings and exemplary debt management gave us easy access to financing from our development partners with very concessional rates and terms, especially during the difficult months of the pandemic. Our average interest rate declined from 5.2% in 2015 to 4.2% in 2020. Last year, we successfully raised 2.7 trillion pesos in gross financing to support our budget needs, respond to the contagion, and continue our economic investments. With abundant liquidity in our own financial system, we have continued to source more than 70% of our borrowings from the domestic market. Due to increased spending to support both health and economic requirements, the pandemic resulted in the global trend of higher government debt to GDP ratios last year. What sets the Philippines apart, however, is that we entered 2020 with a historic low debt to GDP ratio of 39.6%. This means that we could better absorb additional borrowings than other countries whose debt ratios were already at 60% before the pandemic. Hence, the 15 percentage point increase in our debt to GDP ratio in 2020 is still within the prescribed bounds of fiscal viability and the experience of our neighbors and rating peers globally. In addition, more of our fiscal resources are being directed towards productive spending rather than debt servicing. The ratio of our interest payment to expenditures dropped from 13.9% in 2015 to only 9% in 2020. This indicates that our additional borrowing is beneficial to our economic development rather than a burden to growth. In the second quarter of 2021, our economy grew by 11.8%. This is significantly higher than what the market predicted. It underscores the strong capacity of our domestic economy to return to the path of rapid expansion. Reflective of this positive development is the recovery of our revenue collections. For the first 7 months of 2021, total revenue collections reached 1.7 trillion pesos. This is 4% higher compared to the same period in 2020. From January to July of this year, our tax collections grew by 10% to 1.6 trillion pesos compared to the same period last year. With the higher public health bill, however, our deficit was pushed to 837 billion pesos for the first 7 months of this year. This is 20% more than last year's level. In order to cover this budget gap, we needed to borrow more. Fortunately, with our high credit ratings affirmed this year, we were able to negotiate better interest rates and terms. In the first 7 months of 2021, our gross borrowings amounted to 2.2 trillion pesos. Of this amount, 1.8 trillion pesos came from domestic sources. The remaining 442 billion pesos came from external sources through global bond offerings and official development assistance. This includes around 60 billion pesos we contracted from our multilateral partners for the procurement of COVID-19 vaccines. With improving collections, mainly through digitalization, we expect to recover our pre-pandemic revenue levels in 2022. By our projections, we will be collecting 3.3 trillion pesos next year. This is equivalent to 15% of GDP. The estimate is 14% higher than the 2021 revenue collection program of 2.9 trillion pesos or 14.5% of GDP. Revenues will continue to grow from 2022 onwards, reaching 4 trillion pesos in 2024. Our tax collection is projected to reach 3.1 trillion pesos next year, equivalent to 14.2% of GDP. This is significantly higher than the program 2.7 trillion pesos for 2021, equivalent to 13.7% of GDP. Tax collections will be on an upward trend starting next year, reaching 3.8 trillion pesos by 2024. From 2022 onwards, we expect revenues to exceed expenditure growth. We estimate the budget deficit to decrease to 7.5% of GDP next year from the 9.3% of GDP projection for 2021. The medium-term fiscal program will follow a declining deficit path. By 2024, our deficit to GDP ratio will settle at 4.9%. Total gross borrowings for 2022 are programmed to drop to 2.5 trillion pesos from about 3 trillion pesos expected this year. These borrowings will support both our public health response and the economic investments needed to spur growth. Following the pattern set the past few years, the bulk of the borrowing will be sourced locally. Although we have acquired additional debt to meet the health emergency, public borrowing remains well within sustainable levels. National debt to GDP ratio is projected to slightly increase to 60% in 2022 from the program 59% ratio in 2021. Our debt ratio will start its downward trend from 2023 onwards. I would like to emphasize again that the increase in our debt level is only temporary. It did not stem from profligate public spending, but rather resulted from a universal shock that deteriorated the financial positions of almost all countries around the world. The principal contributors to the increase in our debt are the weakening of the economy and lower revenue collections due to the lockdowns, both of which are expected to recover quickly as soon as the infections are contained. To achieve a solid recovery, we need to ensure that fiscal responsibility is constantly observed. The executive and the legislature must work together to fight the pandemic sustainably by keeping our deficit and debt ratios within reasonable levels so that we can leave our finances in great shape for the next administration and the future generations of Filipinos. Fiscal discipline will save us from this long battle against the pandemic. There will be uncertainties in the evolution of the pandemic, to be sure, but with increased vaccination of our people, we should be able to avert severe spikes in the infection rate in the coming period. So far, our vaccination program is in the right direction. We have been receiving a steady supply of vaccines from multiple sources and have been vaccinating our people apace. Our running total of vaccine supply has already reached 52.8 million doses, and we have successfully administered 36.2 million vaccine shots as of September 6. This consists of 20.9 million for the first dose and 15.3 million for the second shot. The remaining months of the year, we expect the arrival of about 142 million doses. With more reliable vaccine deliveries, we are ready to scale up the inoculation drive. We have managed to administer 710 vaccine shots in a single day. We are aiming to bring that up to 1 million a day to achieve the inoculation of all Filipino adults by the end of the year. We will also continue building up our public healthcare system and improving on our tracking, tracing, and treatment methods to withstand any possible surge in infections. The goal here is to remove the pandemic as a determinant of how our economy performs. In the remaining period of the president's term, we will rapidly modernize governance, continue our public investments, and pursue market-friendly reforms to achieve a strong economic rebound. With its high multiplier effect, we will maintain the pace of our Build, Build, Build program. Our projected infrastructure spending will remain above 5% of our GDP until the end of the president's term. We will continue investing in our young population, which is our strongest asset. With an average age of 25, we have a very young and skilled workforce. They will sustain demand and create wealth for the national economy to resume its path of rapid growth. It is because of this demographic sweet spot that we are confident that we can bounce back strongly from the economic impact of the pandemic. To ensure the long-term recovery of our economy and attract more foreign investments, we will work with Congress to pass the amendments to the Foreign Investments Act, the Public Service Act, and the Retail Trade Liberalization Act. We are also committed to pursue the remaining packages of our tax reform program. These include the improvement of our property valuation system and in the taxation of passive income and financial intermediaries. We are likewise supporting the Capital Market Development Act of 2021. This will further deepen the domestic capital markets by building a sustainable and portable corporate pension system for our people. The Duterte administration is fully determined to restore the vigor of the Philippine economy at the soonest possible time. In the face of this unprecedented crisis, we will continue to work hard until the very last minute of our term to ensure a legacy of a dynamic, market-driven economy for the Filipino people. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Sani Dominguez of DOF. We'd now like to call on the OIC of the DBM, Department of Budget, Yusek Tina Kanda, OIC. Ma'am, you have the floor. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Because of some of my recent health concerns, I would like to request that Undersecretary Rolando Toledo be recognized to present the proposed national expenditure program for 2022, our priority expenditures for next year.
Certainly, Yusek, we wish you good health always. Yusek Toledo, you're recognized. Morning, sir.
Good morning, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to our members of this honorable body. On behalf of the Department of Budget and Management, we present the highlights on priorities of the 5.024 trillion proposed national budget for fiscal year 2022. So this budget, as the last enacted budget of the Duterte administration, will carry forward the plans and programs of the government beyond this administration, and thus also the rewards and gains from our success for the benefit of all Filipinos. But even before significantly, since the budget was prepared in the context of a uniquely challenging time brought about by the global health crisis that has severely affected our country, it is focused on getting us back on the road towards full recovery. It is guided by a strategy supported by three main pillars, which also correspond to the goal of its implementation, namely building resilience amidst the pandemic, sustaining the momentum towards recovery, and continuing the legacy of infrastructure development. Our presentation shall be guided by the following outlines. I will start with a discussion of the medium-term macroeconomic assumptions and fiscal targets, key dimensions, followed by the highlights of the fiscal year 2022 budget, classified into three main pillars, namely, as I mentioned, building resilience amid the pandemic, sustaining the momentum towards recovery, and continuing the legacy of infrastructure development. Now, on the medium-term macroeconomic assumptions. Presented on the screen, as also presented by the BSP Governor Jokno, is the assumptions considered in the formulation of the medium-term fiscal program and the fiscal year 2022 cash budget. Just to let you know, Mr. Chair, during the special budget, special meeting on July 19, 2021, the DBCC reaffirmed its growth target of 6 to 7% in 2021, 7 to 9% in 2022, and 6% in 2024, 23 to 24. These growth targets are hinged on the management of risk and continued gradual and safe reopening of the economy, subject to the strictest compliance to minimum health standards. These growth targets are also considered the latest projections on monetary and trade assumptions endorsed by the BSP. Now, while the country's fiscal position deteriorated because of the pandemic, the prudent fiscal management strategies adopted in the past and implemented by this administration have helped us navigate through this health crisis. So, consistent with the government fiscal consolidation strategy, we will rebuild our fiscal space and prepare for future shocks and risk over the medium term, such as the resurgence of COVID-19 or another health emergency, financial crisis, and natural disaster, among others. Hence, for next year, the deficit program will be lowered to 7.5% of GDP from this year's 9.3%. It will further decline to 5.9% of GDP in 2023 and 4.9% in 2024. So revenue collections efforts will be intensified and expected to grow by an average of 11.6% annually to reach 4 trillion in 2024 from this year's 2.882 trillion. Meanwhile, disbursement will increase by an average of 4% annually to reach 5.298 trillion by 2024 from this year's 4.737 trillion. Now, With respect to the national government's disbursement actual spending in 2022, 2020, actual 2020 spending reached 4.227 trillion. This was 429.7 billion, or 11.3% higher year in year, largely on account of the COVID-19 emergency response of the government. This was, however, below the 4.335 trillion program by 107.8 billion, or 2.5%, with the ongoing implementation of the Bayanihan 2. For this year, the program in disbursement is 4.737 trillion, higher by 509.7 billion, or 12.1%, owing mainly to the implementation of programs and projects under the fiscal year 2021 budget, fiscal 22 continuing appropriations, and the Bayanihan 2. Now, for next year, disbursement are projected to reach 4.955 trillion, or 217.5 billion, 4.6 higher than this year's program. Personal services expenditure will reach 1.145 trillion, equivalent to 28.6% of the total projected disbursements, largely due to the implementation of salary standardization law, hiring of healthcare workers, and to cover the 2018 pension arrears of the military and uniform personnel. Maintenance and other expenditure or expenses will be lower in 2022 at 687.9 billion compared to this year's program, mainly from the base effect of the procurement of COVID-19 vaccines and the impact of the extended validity of the fiscal year 2020 appropriations and the Bayanihan law this year. Meanwhile, infrastructure and other capital outlays will substantially increase next year with this administration's massive infrastructure investment through the Build program. As a result, the overall infrastructure program, which includes the transfers to GOCCs and the local government units, intended for infrastructure activities will reach 5.8% of GDP in 2022, from this year's 5.1% and last year's 4.8%. Finally, the transfer of LGUs will amount to 1.112 trillion, growing by 246.3 billion, or 28.3%, largely due to the increase of the national tax allotment of LGUs pursuant to Bandana's ruling. Specifically, the NTA will raise 959 billion in 2022 compared to 695.5 billion this year. Mr. Chair, just to let the committee, the DBM received the total 7.7 trillion worth of agency budget proposals and spent the past few months evaluating them to accommodate the priority programs of the national government into the DBCC approved expenditure ceiling of 5.024 budget. Now, as far as the dimension of the budget, presented on the screen is the fiscal year 2022 proposed budget by expense class. Personal services expenditures amount to 1.5 trillion. This is 29% of the 5.024 trillion proposed expenditure program and 12% higher year on year. Included in these expenses are: number one, increase in the third tranche implementation of the Salary Standardization Law 5, requirements for the hiring of healthcare workers in the DOH and personnel in the DepEd, and the 2018 military and uniform personnel pension arrears. Maintenance and other operating expenditures, or the MOE, will reach 777.9 billion next year, or 15.5% of the total proposed budget. Capital outlays amounts to 939.8 billion. This corresponds to 18.7% of the proposed budget and 4.8% of the total proposed budget. Meanwhile, the support to GOCCs composed of subsidy and equity will increase by 12.4% to reach 178 billion. This is equivalent to 3.5% of the total proposed budget next year. That burden will comprise just 10.8% of the budget and lower by 3.4% to 541.3 billion. Tax expenditure will be pegged at 14.5 billion, same with this year's level. And finally, LGU's share will amount to 1.1 trillion or 22.2% of the proposed budget next year. This is substantially higher by 271.8 billion or 32.2% year on year, mainly due to the higher national tax allotment of LGUs consistent with the Supreme Court ruling on Mandana's case. And as I mentioned, specifically, the NTA will reach 959 billion in 2022 compared to 695.5 billion this year. Now, with respect to the sectoral breakdown of the total proposed budget next year, the biggest allocation will be provided to social services sector amounting to 1.9 trillion, equivalent to 38.3%. This is followed by economic services sector, which will receive 1.5 trillion or 29.3%. These two sectors remain to be the government's top priorities as programs and projects for poverty reduction and economic recovery are supported. Meanwhile, general public service sector will be allocated with 862.7 billion, that burden 541.3 billion, and defense with 224.2 billion. Now, in terms of the recipient unit, national government agencies will be allocated with 3.2 trillion or 63.5% of the total proposed 2022 budget. As mentioned, the government also allocates some 541.3 billion to the country's creditors, consisting of 512.2 billion in interest payments and 28.7 billion in net lending assistance to GOCCs. Meanwhile, the LGUs and GOCCs will be allotted with 1.1 trillion and 178 billion respectively. Of the total 5.024 trillion proposed budget, 3.2 trillion or 63.6% will be directly allocated to regions, the breakdown of which is shown on the screen. In terms of the regionalized budget, the Luzon Island Group will be given the highest allocation of 1.1 trillion or 21%. Meanwhile, the remaining 34.6% or 1.8 trillion will go to the non-regionalized budget. This is composed of the nationwide and central office allocation amounting to 1.6 trillion and 243.7 billion respectively. Okay. By budget allocation, the top 10 departments are shown on the screen. Please note that this department, which is the DepEd, the education sector, DPWH, DILG, DOH, DND, the SWD, DOTR, the DA, and the judiciary and the DOLE, have constantly been in the list for the past years. Moving on now to the priorities. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has presented our countries with enormous policy challenges. So policymakers have had to balance limited resources between health, food systems, and economies in continually evolving public health emergency and associated recession. We faced especially difficult choices because of limited budgets and administrative capacity. For the past year, we hurdled several community quarantines to prevent the spread of COVID-19, which severely affected households and businesses. So the government made relentless efforts towards economic recovery by making the targeted investment and social protection in hard-hit sectors. However, it cannot be overemphasized that building long-term resiliency should start with containing the spread of COVID-19. So we wish to highlight some features of next year's budget. So the proposed fiscal year 2022 national budget continues to emphasize the health and social services sector by supporting the expansion of medical infrastructure of our health system. The DOH shall be supported with an allocation of 19.6 billion for its health facilities enhancement program for the construction, rehabilitation, and upgrading of health facilities and purchase of medical equipment and procurement of ambulances. This includes an amount of 1.4 billion to cover the requirements for the newly established government hospitals. We have allocated 819 million for personal protective equipment or the PPE for DOH hospitals, laboratories, and centers for health development, equivalent to a total of 758,700 sets to complete PPEs at a tentative cost of 1,080 per set. So the DOH will be provided 106 million for the one hospital command center. So the OHCC will facilitate the comprehensive and coordinated response to the COVID-19 pandemic by ensuring effective and efficient health facility referral in Metro Manila. So the OHCC will also facilitate medical transport and patient pickup arrangement, provide health system capacity, data analytics, and risk communication, and optimize the use of critical care services of every hospital in the area. Now, 501 billion will be for the purchase of about 11 million Gen Expert cartridges for Gen Expert's machines used in COVID-19 testing, and 3.8 billion for the continuous emergency hiring of human resources for health workers for COVID-19 response. Under the program appropriations, the DOH shall be allocated an amount of 45.4 billion to cover the COVID-19 booster shot of 89.331 million fully vaccinated Filipinos. In addition, 375.6 million for COVID-19 related expenses of the VMMC and AFP Medical Center will be provided to ensure appropriate medical care for veterans, their dependents, and the military and civilian personnel of the armed forces of the Philippines. Now, to support research and development to address the threat of COVID-19, the DOST shall be allocated a total of 1.3 billion to support its initiative against COVID-19, as well as the establishment of the Virology Science and Technology Institute of the Philippines, which will lead the research and development efforts in virology in the country. Moreover, the amount of 140 million will be provided for the Philippine Genomic Information and Resource Hub to strengthen the capacity of the UP Philippine Genome Center in its continuous genomic biosurveillance and immune biosurveillance of COVID-19 variant. Now, apart from the health system development, the government prioritizes the needs of the Filipino people and the development priorities of the administration. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to bring greater challenges to the most vulnerable groups, hence social protection of these sectors needs will be sustained. The National Health Insurance Program will be provided with 80 billion for social health protection. This is to subsidize the health insurance premiums of 13.2 million indigent families identified under the National Household Targeting System of the DSWD and 7.3 million senior citizens pursuant to RA number 10645. On the other hand, the medical assistance to indigent patients will be allocated 17 billion for the implementation of the Malasakit Center Act of 2019. So the HRH program under its regular PAP will be provided with 17 billion to cover the hiring and deployment of health service professionals, an urgent necessity under the current situation. Meanwhile, the Department of Social Welfare and Development will continue to implement the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program with an allocation of 115.7 billion, social pension for indigent senior citizens with 23.5 billion, protective services for individuals and families in difficult circumstances, 18 billion, sustainable livelihood program, 4.9 billion, supplementary feeding program, 4.2 billion, and Balik Probinsya Bagong Pag-asa program, 2.7 billion. Now, the livelihood and emergency employment program of the DOLE shall receive a total budget of 22.3 billion, of which the Tulong Panghanap Buhay sa Ating Disadvantaged Displaced Workers or TUPAD program and government internship program shall receive 21 billion, while DOLE Integrated Livelihood Program will be provided with 809.5 million. On the other hand, the Adjustment Measure Program will be given 491.6 million. These programs shall continue to assist and support displaced workers affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The DOLE OWA's Emergency Repatriation Program shall receive a budget of 11.2 billion, while Reintegration Services Program will be given 52.7 million. The assistance for our repatriated OFWs includes airport assistance, including temporary shelter, psychosocial counseling, stress debriefing, and transport services or allowance to their respective provinces. Due to the change in the learning and employment landscape brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, the following priority programs and projects in the education sector will be implemented in fiscal year 2022. There is universal access to quality tertiary education with 49.7 billion, education assistance and subsidies with a total of 13.1 billion. Under that is the education service contracting for junior high schools and the SHS voucher programs, student financial assistance program, private education, student financial assistance, and the basic education facilities with 5.4 billion allocation. Now, development, production, and delivery of learning resources for the basic education, learning continuity plan, DepEd computerization program, scope-based feeding program, and alternative learning system. So TESDA has several programs for training, reskilling, and retooling the workforce to cater to the needs of the new normal and to build long-term resilience against future crises. For the 2022, the Tulong Trabaho Scholarship Program is allocated with 1 billion. The Training for Work Scholarship Program with 3.8 billion. The Special Training for Employment Program with 2.1 billion. This will be supported with the construction of innovation centers funded with 200 million and establishment of TESDA Learning Center 4.0 ready with 500 million. The latter will provide the Filipino workforce access to world-class and technologically advanced training facility that will be an advantage in both the local and world labor market. For the agriculture and fisheries sector, support services will be provided by the government through NIA's irrigation services amounting to 21.8 billion. The DA's banner program on rice and corn, including RCEF, high value crops, dairy, livestock, and fisheries will be allocated 38 billion. Credit and insurance for this sector will be supported in the amount of 7 billion. MSEs, along with crop insurance, will also be made available for farmers in order to restore and sustain their activities. Now, the TTI was provided with 3.5 billion for programs, projects to support the recovery of those in the MSME sector, of which 728 million is for the maintenance of 1,266 negotiation centers. This will assist 10,586 MSMEs. To help the MSMEs in addressing cash flow constraints, difficulty in overhead cost, and disruption in supply chain, the fiscal year 2022 budget provides 1.5 billion to the Pondo sa Pagbabago at Pag-asenso, or the P3 program. The National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC, will be supported with 30.5 billion for fiscal year 2022, while the Philippine Anti-Illegal Drugs Strategy will be supported with 2.5 billion. The national government will continue the implementation of the Philippines Identification System, or the PhilSys. 4.8 billion is allotted to cover the provision of the Philippine identification cards to additional 20 million individuals for 2022. 739 million is allotted for the conduct of the census of agriculture and fisheries, while 574.2 million is being allotted for the conduct of community-based monitoring system. Despite the initial setbacks due to the pandemic, the Build program has allowed us to make significant strides in addressing the infrastructure gap that continues to be a bottleneck to the country's growth potential, as well as be a major employment and investment drivers to establish a more solid foundation for the country's economic recovery. Infrastructure development remains a priority of this administration, with its multiplier effects expected to boost the revival of the economy. So the Build program will still be in full swing in 2022. Hence, overall, we are proposing an infrastructure budget of 1.18 trillion, equivalent to 5.3% of GDP. This slide shows the proposed infrastructure budget for fiscal year 2022 by department. Among the executive departments, the DPWH and the DOTR shall receive the bulk of the infrastructure budget, with respective budgets of 655 billion and 127.5 billion respectively. Now, for DPWH, some 378.7 billion will be used to finance the implementation of its major programs, as shown on the screen. Further, the Convergence and Special Support Program shall receive 206.5 billion, which includes provision for the sustainable infrastructure projects, alleviating gaps, and the basic infrastructure program. The DOTR will be provided with the proposed budget of 151.3 billion, which is 72.2% higher than its fiscal year 2021 budget. The rail transport program will receive 73.3% of this budget to implement ongoing rail projects such as the flagship North-South Commuter Railway project. Other sectors will also be provided transport support, including the maritime infrastructure program projects like the Sorsogon Roro Terminal and land public transportation program, which will be provided with 1.2 billion and 27.7 billion for infrastructure, preparation, and innovation facility and payment of right-of-way, respectively. Now, budget for ICT projects under the medium-term Information and Communications Technology Harmonization Initiative, or MITI, amounts to 16.4 billion, with the emphasis on work-from-home arrangements. Video conferencing and other modes of digital communication has to be continuously developed to improve efficiency and productivity. Mr. Chair, thank you for your attention. In closing, again, in behalf of the government and people, we implore the honorable representatives of our people to consider and pass the proposed national budget. We earnestly hope that with this budget, we can effectively manage this context of radical uncertainty brought about by the crisis and finally overcome and rise above it. Thank you and very much, and God bless. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusek Toledo, Yusek Tinakanda. I'm also informed that we have with us NEDA PPP Center, Director Pexon, DBM Procurement Service, DBM Executive Director Uwayan, Deputy Executive Secretary Jill Fernandez. Good morning, Your Honors. So now we'll turn it over. The Chairman has some questions, but we'll ask those later after all our members have had a chance to ask. And just again, each member will be given 10 minutes, and we'll start with our Senate officers. And the order is Senators Recto, Zubiri, Drilon, Lacson, Marcos, Villar, Villanueva, Cayetano, Tolentino, Ontiveros, Binay, De La Rosa, Gatchalian, Pangilinan, Poe, Pimentel, Go, Gordon. We'll now start with the Senate President pro tempore, Senator Ralph Recto. Sir, you have the floor. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all our resource persons. Thank you very much for your service and for your presentation today. I will try to be as brief as possible, knowing that many of our colleagues would want to ask questions. So let me begin. We all know that the economy could recover sooner. That would be dependent on how we effectively and quickly address the pandemic. Having said that, may I ask from our resource persons, one, is there a change of strategy with regard to our vaccination program? Meaning to say, we started this year by saying that we would inoculate 77 million people before the end of the year, and that would require 144 million doses. How are we insofar as this is concerned? Maybe we should ask NEDA.
Yes, Sec Carl, would you like to respond regarding? You're asking Senator Ralph regarding any pivot, no? Latest developments, no?
Mr. Chair, Senator Recto, as I presented a while ago, we have administered around 36 million doses. Initially, I understand that 70% would be needed for a herd immunity. But because of the Delta variant, there are now new studies suggesting either a higher level of herd immunity or learning to accept that this virus may become endemic, meaning it may not disappear soon, thus requiring annual shots as if it were a flu. So that is the evolving thinking. And I understand the budget for next year has allocation for booster shot. Of course, we are monitoring this and trying to understand the direction on how we deal with the vaccination strategy. Thank you.
It doses 77 million Filipinos. Will we be able to achieve that before the end of the year? Because that was the original plan.
Mr. Chair, I am looking at the supply that is projected to come in the next few months, and it appears that there is a steady supply that is coming to help us achieve that. But I think Secretary Dominguez might be able to also contribute on this question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks, Secretary.
Chairman. Uh,
Morning, Secretary Dominguez.
Senator Recto, yeah, good morning. You know, what we need to inoculate everybody is 9 million doses arriving a week. Okay. We have already ordered it. We have set aside the money for it. Now it is up to the pharmas to deliver. And so far, this first week of September, we are already short. Okay, I report. I'll try to report that every week now. But basically, 9 million a week and doses arriving a week is what we need. Last week, I think we only got 3.5. So it is a matter of supply. Everything is already there. The order is there. The negotiations have been complete. The money is ready. So now we are waiting for the pharmas to step up to the plate. Thank you.
Yes. Based on current trends, so it would appear that we would not be able to vaccinate 77 million Filipinos before the end of the year. Based on current trends, would it be safe to say that in the first quarter of next year, we would be able to vaccinate 77 million?
That looks probable. That looks probable. But again, Mr. Senator, Mr. Chairman, you know, there are vagaries of supplies. Last month, one of the mRNA suppliers had problems. They had a batch that was very bad, and the deliveries to the private sector orders were delayed. So again, you know, we hope for the best, and fortunately, we have been able to get a steady supply, particularly from Sinovac. They have come up with more than 50% of our deliveries. They're quite steady. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. No? So it would be good if the committee could be given some timeline of some sort, no? Based on current trends, where we are today, and
Yes.
when do we expect to be able to inoculate at least 70% of the population? And, you know, I take note also of what Secretary Carl said, that maybe because of the Delta variant, we might have to inoculate 90% of the population. No? Now, having said that, my next question is, are we appropriating enough in the budget of the Department of Health to address other issues, no? Like testing, treating, isolating patients, so on and so forth? And do we have adequate resources to purchase medicines necessary to treat patients with COVID? I noticed that the budget for the health department will be less this year than last year. Is that a correct assessment? Maybe the secretary of the DBM?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chair, I would like to answer.
Yes, please.
I'll be allowed, yes. The budget of DOH, has been reduced because of two things. One is that it contains congressionally introduced changes, and number two, there are certain items in the budget of DOH which are considered devolved as a result of the Mandanas Garcia case, Your Honor. So actually that corresponds to the reduction. As to the amount that we provided for DOH for COVID related, it's built in under their specific fees.
Mr. Chairman, Secretary, what is the relationship of the Mandanas ruling with regard to our spending for the Department of Health?
There are certain programs, Your Honor, which has been devolved to local government units. So